Our next speaker is going to be Samuel Zinner. He's doing it remotely from Tuscany in Italy. I deeply envy him for being in Tuscany. Anyway, the cosmic temple of divine names, sapiential, nomistic, and numerical properties is the topic of his presentation. The presentation is going to be a little longer, about 45 minutes, after which David Calabro is going to be responding. Samuel.
Hello, everybody. I want to thank Jeff Bradshaw and all the organizers of this conference for inviting me to speak. I may seem an unlikely candidate for invitation, given that my Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. I want to thank Jeff Bradshaw and all the organizers of this conference for inviting. Hello, everybody. I want to thank Jeff Bradshaw and all the organizers of this conference for inviting me to speak. I may seem an unlikely candidate for invitation, given that my preferences are rabbinic, but I've always believed that conversation with those who do not see the world in the same way is always a good thing. So without further ado, I'll begin my paper. As Alexander Grun documents, the typical ancient Near Eastern creation story tends to end with the establishment of a divine temple, in which the king is crowned as symbol of bringing cosmic order out of chaos. By contrast, Genesis' first creation story reaches its apex with the establishment of the divine Sabbath. Building on Grun's work, Matthias de Jong explains as follows to the writers of the first Genesis creation story. The P writers have rewritten this paradigm. Instead of kingship, they honor the seventh day as the principle that keeps the world together. The central focus is not military force and dominance, but holiness. Instead of a king, YHWH chooses the people of Israel as his deputy. Furthermore, the tight bond between the supreme God and his deputy on earth is not demonstrated on the battlefield. Instead, the bond between God and Israel becomes evident in their joint venture of keeping the Sabbath as a holy day. Unquote. So the summit of creation is not humanity made in the image of God on the sixth day, but the crowning of creation with the Sabbath. De Jong cites John Levinson, quote, Genesis 1:1 through chapter 2, verse 3 points to the seventh day as the clue to the meaning of creation. Moreover, unquote, Genesis 2:1 through 3 does not explicitly give the name of the Sabbath, but only hints at it via the cognate verb. Similarly, the first creation account does not give God's name, YHWH, but only hints at it with Elohim. This clearly suggests a theological relation between the Sabbath and the Tetragrammaton, both of which are holy, to be sanctified, that is, to be treated as divine. Although the first Genesis creation story does not culminate with the building of a temple, we must not overlook that Exodus 39 through 40's account of the building and completion of the tabernacle, the forerunner to the later temple, is clearly made to echo the first creation story in Genesis. De Jong explains of Israel, quote, they keep the earth in harmony with heaven. For P, the center of the world is the place where God is revered as the supreme God by those who know his true name and live according to the holy sabbatical pattern. The world's center is the community of Sabbath observers around the sanctuary of the God who crowned his creation with the Sabbath as the ordering principle, unquote. Lastly, from De Jong, another important but often overlooked point, the Sabbath is, quote, much more than a requirement or a cultic obligation. It is an entrance to God's presence, a way for Israel to experience God's presence in their midst. Sabbath can therefore be described as the connective element between YHWH and Israel. Exodus 31:17 calls the Sabbath the eternal sign of the bond between YHWH and Israel, unquote. Over the past few decades, scholarship has identified and discussed the subtextual relationship, a correlation between Sabbath and temple in Genesis' first creation story. That is Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 3. In view of this correlation, we can either identify the creation as a cosmic temple or draw the conclusion that the Sabbath is somehow functionally equivalent to the temple. The two propositions do not necessarily exclude each other. So in Baruch 3, 24 through 25, the creation is the house or temple of God. Here, the idea of a limitless creation does not necessarily imply a spatially infinite cosmos, although that's an exegetical possibility. The passage could include the idea that God's creative activity was not limited temporally to the 6 days of creation, but continues in each moment, without which the cosmos would cease to exist. With the Baruch passage, we can compare Philo, Special Laws, Book 1, paragraph 66. Quote, we ought to look upon the universal world as the highest and truest temple of God, having for its most holy place that most sacred part of the essence of all existing things, namely the heaven, unquote. Contextually, Baruch 3, 24 through 25's cosmic house could also be called the house of wisdom. Recall Proverbs 9:1, wisdom has built her house. Which, or more accurately, who is the subject of the preceding and following verses. This is the personified Lady Wisdom of Proverbs 8, through whom God brought about creation. This Lady Wisdom in Baruch is simultaneously also the Lady Torah, who is clear, right, or which is clear from Baruch 3, 29 through 30's application to Lady Wisdom of attributes assigned to Torah in Deuteronomy 30, verses 12 and 13. In Baruch 3:38 through 4:1, we read, afterwards she appeared upon earth and lived among men. She is the book of the commandments of God and the law that endures forever. In the next Baruch passage, this Lady Wisdom, or Torah, seamlessly morphs into Mother Zion, who together with God as Father brings forth the children of Zion. Already Psalm 19 links together Genesis 1's theme of creation with Proverbs 8's Lady Wisdom. Psalm 19 identifying this personified wisdom with the Torah, the bride of the solar El. This suggests that Psalm 19 has already taken the step of linking together Genesis 1:1 and Proverbs 8:22 through their shared term, Reshit. Psalm 19 does not contain the noun Reshit. Nevertheless, that Psalm 19 has linked together Genesis 1:1 and Proverbs 8:22 through the shared term Reshit seems probable. This is because it's clear that both Genesis 1 and Proverbs 8 served as inspirations for Psalm 19's composition, and it is most unlikely that any scribe would have overlooked these two texts' common term Reshit, especially given that it occurs in the first verse of Genesis and in the first stick of the poem that begins in Proverbs 8:22. The later rabbinic interpretation that sees in Proverbs 8:22's Reshit an echo of Genesis 1:1's Reshit, understood as Lady Wisdom or Torah, is therefore rooted in the Tanakh, specifically in Psalm 19, rather than in exclusively post-Tanakh sources. Psalm 19 partly constructs its Lady Torah out of various divine attributes borrowed from Deuteronomy 32's Great Song of Moses, largely, though not entirely, mediated via Proverbs 8. Lady Wisdom, or Lady Torah, is personified. In ancient Near Eastern cultures, the word, or the speech of the gods, was considered personified. We could call this a hypostasis. When the divine word was transferred to writing, the divine speech remains personified. This is to a large extent explains the origin of the idea of a personified book. Divine speech is a person. Book religion. He directed it in a specifically Jewish modality. Jeffrey Cooley has pointed out that Genesis 6 plus 1 days of creation become Psalm 19's 6 plus 1 instances of the Tetragrammaton. The first 6 Tetragrammatons occur in quick succession in the praises of Lady Torah in verses 8 through 10, while the 7th Tetragrammaton occurs in the final verse 15, one of the most important biblical verses in the Jewish Seder. Verse 8's word Torah in the phrase Torah YHWH, and verse 15's Tetragrammaton spans 70 words, congruent with a hint at the simple numerical value, that's the mispar seduri, of verse 8's Torah. All scholars are aware of the distinctive use of Elohim in Genesis' first creation account, and of YHWH Elohim in the second creation account that begins in Genesis 2:4. The use of different divine names does not result in this particular case from the use of different sources, but reflects a unified theology of divine names, a theology that includes an interest in symbolic numerical values. In the first creation account, Elohim occurs 35 times. That is 7 times 5 equals 35. This suggests an interest in the number 7 for obvious reasons. The first creation account in Genesis comprises 469 words. 469 is a multiple of 7. 7 times 67. 469. The story of Cain and Abel, recorded in Genesis chapter 4, right after the second creation account, comprises 26 pasukim. The verse total agrees with the numerical value of the Tetragrammaton, 26, a divine name that occurs 10 times in Genesis 4. And the chapter ends with the statement, "Then began men to call upon the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh," and indicated that the choice of 26 verses forms an intentional hint at the Tetragrammaton's numerical value. The concern with number symbolism continues in Genesis chapter 5, which comprises the genealogical table of the 10 generations from Adam to Noah. Genesis 5:23's 365 years of Enoch's life contains a well-known numerical symbolism that hints at the number of days in a solar year. Less well known is that Genesis 5's genealogical table has a word total of 365. Another hint at Enoch in the solar calendar. Moreover, Enoch is the 7th patriarch named in the genealogical list. The significance of 7 harks back to the number symbolism of the first creation accounts, 6 days of creation crowned by the 7th day, the Sabbath. A Sabbath symbolism, therefore, inheres in Enoch by virtue of his position as 7th patriarch from Adam. Lastly, in the genealogical list of 10 generations, God, or Elohim, is mentioned only in relation to Adam and Enoch. The only other divine name mentioned in the genealogical list is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh in verse 29's remark about the meaning of the name Noah, namely rest, which semantically overlaps synonymously with the Sabbath. This intimates that these 3 are the most important of the 10 patriarchs, but by virtue of the genealogical list's word total of 365, Enoch is the most important, or at least the most emphasized of all. The question of whether these patterns, based on various divine names' numerical values, represent original compositional or later redactional levels is an open issue. For present purposes, it will suffice to note that there are plausible reasons to doubt that Hebrew scribes learned of gematria from Greeks only in the Hellenistic era. Scott B. Nagel offers the following survey in his recent monograph on wordplay in the ancient Near East. I quote, "The earliest discussion of isopsophy in the Hebrew Bible occurs in rabbinic texts where the device is called gematria. Consequently, scholars debate whether the proposed cases represent later eisegetical readings or exegetical traditions passed on from an earlier age. Evidence for the latter comes from Akkadian texts like those I discussed above that employ isopsophy as an exegetical tool. Additional evidence comes from some biblical acrostics which appear to reflect an awareness of the consonants' numerical values, in addition to an abecedary and the names of the consonants, right? For example, in Proverbs 31:22. Indeed, solid evidence for isopsophy does not exist in Israel until the start of the 1st century BCE. where it appears on coins. During the monarchic period, evidence from Ostraka shows that the Israelites used the Egyptian hieratic numeral system. Later, the Mesopotamian sexagesimal system was adopted. This has suggested to some that Hebrew isopsophy represents an adaptation of later Greek practice. On the other hand, it is possible that in early Israel, isopsophy was purely an exegetical device employed in elite circles, and so perhaps we should not expect to find it on common objects. Unquote. Indeed, the claim that Jews adopted a gematria from the Greeks doesn't fit well with the function of gematria in Judaism, which Nagel points out, which was exegetical, and this fits ancient Near Eastern praxis, not Hellenistic praxis. Nagel mentions that in rabbinic literature, in the Bavli, that's a Babylonian Talmud, Nedarim 32a, that, quote, the 318 soldiers who battled with Abram against the kings of the east, Genesis 14:14, is an isopsophy for Abram's servant Eleazar, whose name equals 318. Another proposal has been the name Gad in Genesis 46:16, because its numerical value is 7, and the name appears in a chapter replete with sevens, including the number of his sons and multiples of sevens, unquote. Nagel also lists Ezekiel 4:8's phrase, Yeme Metzur, the days of your siege, whose gematria is 390, and the next verse mentions 390 days. The first instance of gematria in the Torah would seem to be Genesis 1:5, with its notable use of 1 day instead of the ordinal form, the first day. The use of echad seems intentional because its numerical value is 13, which agrees with Genesis 1:5's word total, and indeed echad is the verse's 13th concluding word. Richard Steiner's relatively recent work on the biblical nephesh has begun to turn the tide away from the formerly reigning scholarly view that ancient Israelites had no belief in a soul capable of disembodiment, especially at death, that such a body-soul dualism idea was adopted by some sectors of Jewish thought only after its encounter with Hellenistic philosophy. In retrospect, the claim that Israel alone of all ancient Near Eastern cultures had no belief in a soul that survived the body's demise at death seems fundamentally implausible, given that similarly the use of gematria was practiced throughout the ancient Near East. It seems questionable to hold that it was alone unknown to ancient Hebrew scribes. The Masoretic text of Genesis 1:1, with its numerical pattern of 14 plus 14 equals 28 letters, 7 times 2 plus 7 times 2, brings up the question of orthographic stability. 28 is the second perfect number, while 6 is the first. The relevance of 6 being that the Torah's first word comprises 6 letters. Consider first the New Testament. One cannot simply dismiss an original text for the New Testament books by referring to the great variety of orthographic variants in the papyri. It is precisely by comparing these variants that an original text can be reconstructed with varying levels of confidence, to be sure. No one doubts that there will be future revisions to Nestle Ireland's edition 28, but no one should doubt that such future revisions will be quite minimal in number. Alas, one must guard against reifying the notion that texts should not be reified in the first place. Similarly, textual stability of the Tanakh cannot in every instance be assailed by the example of the variants in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These variants have in some instances been exaggerated through various misunderstandings. It bears pointing out that a lot of scholarship was led astray by enthusiasm after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls on account of their divergences from the Masoretic text. In recent years, a more sober attitude has set in as scholars have begun to realize that some of the Qumran scrolls, like the Samuel scrolls, contain divergences from the Masoretic text that are secondary to the Masoretic text, often being based on sectarian impulses or anthological genres, not on more original readings than those transmitted by the Masoretic text. First of all, we must speak of one biblical book at a time. With regard to the Psalter, Peter Flint's thesis that its text and enumeration were fluid into the first century CE is not tenable. I've written elsewhere that the importance of 11Q PSA, also known as 11Q5, that Psalm scroll, should not be exaggerated unduly, for as Tyler F. Williams plausibly points out, this was an alternative Psalter that reflected the sectarian outlook of the Qumran community. It functions polemically to undergird the authenticity of that scroll itself. The scroll was an alternative sectarian Psalter that the Qumran community maintained in opposition to the earlier Masoretic Psalter, unquote. Although William's stance might not accord with current majority opinion, Jeffrey L. Spence's monograph-length argumentation on the same subject cannot be summarily dismissed without any systematic refutation, and none has been forthcoming. The same point applies to a recent 2014 study by Eva Yine. It would be difficult to conceive that all scholars representing the majority opinion would be able to dismiss convincingly each and every one of Spence's and Yine's arguments. Or take the example of the Book of Samuel. The latest comprehensive study of 4Q Samuel A is Jason K. Driesbach, 4Q Samuel A, and the text of Samuel. He wisely cautions against exaggerating the importance of 4Q Samuel A in general, quote, and generally Masoretic text is also close to the original, while the GL and 4Q show a marked increase in secondary readings. We read further in the same work, 4Q cannot be described as an inherently more trustworthy witness than MT or G, as the Old Greek or the Septuagint. This study shows that 4Q contains more exegesis than the Masoretic text. These facts point toward a resolution to the problem of the varying scholarly assessments of 4Q's unique readings, which have been based on incomplete evidence. My analysis of secondary readings and the witnesses results in the observation that 4Q is about 50% more likely than the Masoretic text or the Greek text to contain a secondary reading in passages where all are attested, unquote. All right, as for the Hebrew Bible as a whole, until recently, the prevailing scholarly paradigm held that first, there was a period of textual fluidity and pluriformity followed after 70 of the Common Era by a later textual standardization or stabilization by which the Masoretic text replaced the earlier pluriform texts. This model has been undermined recently by fresh examinations of the extant evidence, which goes back to about 250 years before the Common Era, and indicates that from this earliest period, a fixed Masoretic-like text coexisted together with pluriform texts. After 70 of the Common Era, the fixed Masoretic-like text survived alongside texts like the Targumim, which continued the earlier tradition of pluriform readings based on creative exegesis. There was thus both fixity and pluriformity both before and after the Second Temple period. Emmanuel Tove's research indicates that the Masoretic text and Septuagint are strikingly similar and that their differences should not be exaggerated. Quote, my general impression is that the number of differences between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint is relatively small, allowing us to posit a common reading tradition at the base of all these sources, unquote. The new model, though contested, is not overturned by the claim that the Masoretic text, the Masoretic-like text, was a Vulgate rather than an authoritative text. For however one describes the Masoretic-like text, it was a fixed text that stood in contrast to creative pluriform texts, such as the ones we see at Qumran often. Unfortunately, as Waltka and O'Connor remind us, anti-Masoretic text bias endures among scholars. Quote, early in the modern period, some scholars tended to dismiss the Masoretic wholesale, sometimes on the unfortunate grounds that it was the work of Jews. Such scurrilous anti-Semitic attacks have long since disappeared, but suspicion of the Masoretic text has remained. Unquote. Given the antiquity of the Tanakh, there will always remain some uncertainty in original orthography. However, some texts will afford higher degrees of confidence than others. To anticipate a later part of my presentation, I believe we can, for example, reconstruct Psalm 1 down to the level of each and every letter. The same cannot be said for every psalm. In the end, the identification of letter or numerical patterns in a text does not depend solely on textual stability throughout the ages. This is because it will often have been the case that knowledge of an author's letter or numerical patterns in a particular text was either lost or even never communicated to others. Also, one has to be aware of the genre of any given papyrus, scroll, or codex. Was it created as an authoritative text for liturgy or temple use, or merely for personal use, such as devotion, reference, or scribal exercises? Now let's talk about the promised land as the temple in Psalm 23. If the Sabbath is realized in the temple, it is the case also that the land or earth of Eden is the divine temple. Eden is both anticipation and retrospective of the Jerusalem temple and the promised land. This correlation of land and temple appears in Psalm 23, although it's often overlooked. Notice how Psalm 23 opens with a description of the land, that is, of Edenic-like green pastures and still waters, and closes with the trope of dwelling in the temple for length of days. These two portions of text, respectively beginning with the land and ending with in the temple, each comprises 26 words. These two textual blocks are joined by verse 3's words, Ki ata amadi, for thou art with me, which constitutes Psalm 23's mathematical center. This produces the pattern 26 plus 3 plus 26 equals 55 words. In this functionally associative way, the earth and the temple share a participation in the sacred numerical value of 26, the Tetragrammaton, which fittingly occurs once in each block of 26 words, which we see in the slide here. The, the yellow text beginning after the two-word superscription, the 26 words, so we get to the green text, Ki ata amadi, for thou art with me, followed by 26 words, and the blue highlighting their highlights an encryption of the name Joshua, whose last letter is placed in the final word of Psalm 23's 3 middle words. It's going in reverse. The convention here, this encryption, which can also be called a Sausterian anagram, which more biblical scholars should be familiar with than they currently are. This convention corresponds to a widespread ancient and Eastern praxis called notarikon, or also acronym, of course, which, like acrostics, can appear in either forward or reverse sequences. And these types of encryptions occur already in the first line of the Psalter. In Psalm 1, if you read the first 4 words, I believe, you will see the encryption of the name Israel. Regarding the encrypted name Joshua in Psalm 23, it is correct that, as an anonymous reviewer pointed out, 3 of the 5 letters are very common grammatical elements. Nevertheless, it bears pointing out that this letter sequence, Yod, He, Vav, Shin, Ayin, the letters of Joshua, is statistically rare, occurring nowhere else in the entirety of the Tanakh. While common letters can and do produce random patterns, common letters can also facilitate a scribe's intentional creation of encrypted patterns. In that scenario, we have nature serving art. An allusion to Joshua is not out of place in Psalm 23. As I will show, there is an important intentional textual link between Psalm 23 and the nearby Psalm 19, the Psalter's second Torah psalm, an intermediary link back to Psalm 1, the Psalter's first Torah psalm, whose second verse famously parallels Joshua 1:8's imperative to study the Torah day and night. Clearly similar to Psalm 23 is also the nearby Joshua 1:5, quote, there shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee, unquote. Then there is the allusion to the etymology of the name Joshua in the nearby Psalm 27:1's opening line, the Lord is my salvation. All right, moreover, Psalm 23's subtextual encrypted allusion to Joshua supplies us with the exegetical key to Psalm 23's surtext, namely that Psalm 23 is largely built out of allusions to the story of Joshua's succession to Moses in Deuteronomy's final chapters into Joshua chapter 1. All right, so I won't go into all the details, which take up more than 2 pages in my file here. But I would say that the pertinence of Psalm 23's encrypted name Joshua to the straightforward text is that it was Joshua who led the children of Israel into the promised land. God promised that he would be with Joshua, who need fear no evil, if he and Israel would observe the Torah, with the result that they would dwell in the land for length of days. Clearly, this Deuteronomy phraseology has been modulated in Psalm 23:6 to refer to the dwelling in the house of Yod He Vav He for length of days. Incidentally, as noted above, Psalm 23:3, he restoreth my soul, harks back to Psalm 19:8, the law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul. So in Psalm 23, the Lord restores the soul by means of the Torah of the Lord. So Psalm 23 is all about the Torah, and this has too often been overlooked. Another example of a Psalter acronym built out of very common Hebrew letters, namely Yod He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton, is Psalm 96:11. Again, we have reason to suspect this acronym is not the result of randomness. Klaus Sprunk writes the following, right? Another example of this kind of acrostic may be found in Psalm 96:11, where the initial letters of the 7 words read Yod He Vav He, Yod He Vav. However, with these letters found so often at the beginning of a word, this could be ascribed to the accidents of language, as is rightly remarked by G.R. Driver. An important argument in favor of the suggested acrostic is that it fits the context. All are called up to say that Yod He Vav He is king in verse 10. The acrostic in verse 11 could be interpreted as an indication of heaven and earth doing so. I find Sprunk's arguments weak, but they can be strengthened as follows. You see here in the slide, in favor of an intentional encryption in Psalm 96:11 are 5 additional facts. First, the encryption works in reverse as well. That is, Yod He Vav He is encrypted in an overlapping way, both right to left and left to right. So you see here in yellow, Yod He Vav He, right to left. Then the next word, after Yod Haaretz there, Yiram, right? Then work backwards from the first blue highlighting, and then you have Yod He Vav He again. Second, the encrypted Yod He Vav He, Yod He Vav ends at the verse's letter 26, which agrees with the Tetragrammaton's numerical value. Third, the reverse Yod He Vav He encryption begins with the Yod of the Yod He Vav encryption. Fourth, the word Yiram, the first word imbricated in the Yod He Vav encryption, is 26 words to Psalm 96's end. Fifth, Psalm 96 comprises 112 words. Thus, 112 is the numerical value of Yod He Vav He Elohim, 26 plus 86. And word 86 is verse 11's Haaretz, which ends the verses right to left, Yod He Vav He encryption. All right, now let's go on to Psalm 1, which we've already mentioned in connection with Psalm 23. To understand why Psalm 23 contains 2 blocks of main text, each of which comprises 26 words, and each of which contains 1 tetragrammaton, we must realize that these structural features deliberately hark back to Psalm 1. In Psalm 1, we have an introductory verse, 1, with 15 words and 55 letters. This is followed by 2 blocks of text, verses 2 through 3 and verses 4 through 6, and each of these blocks contains 26 words, and each has 1 tetragrammaton. Why 2 tetragrammatons in total? A clue to the answer is verse 1's clear echoes of the Shema Yisrael's first paragraph, whose opening line, Deuteronomy 6:4, contains 2 tetragrammatons. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Now, Psalm 1 through Psalm 2, verse 3, contains the mesostic. That is look at the last letter of each first word of each verse. So it contains the mesostic, Yod, Yod, He, Aleph, Lamed, Yod, He, Vav, He. That is, first a single Yod, abbreviating the Tetragrammaton, followed by Yod He, the divine name Yah, the short form of the Tetragrammaton, or the Tetragrammaton's first half. Then follows Aleph, Lamed, the divine name El. Next comes the full Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, joining Psalm 1's final verse to Psalm 2's first 3 verses. There is an abundance of evidence that in Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 we are dealing with intentional encryptions of these divine names. The evidence includes the following 4 points. First, notice that in Psalm 1, the Yod of the first Tetragrammaton is this Psalm's letter number 65, the numerical value of the traditional Tetragrammaton substitute, Adonai. Next, the Yod of the second Tetragrammaton in verse 6 is letter 26 to the verse's end. 26, again, the Tetragrammaton's numerical value. Third, Psalm 2:4's Adonai, the Psalter's first and Psalm 2's only Adonai, is Psalm 2's word 26. Fourth, the Yod of Psalm 2's final Tetragrammaton, verse 11, is 65 letters to Psalm 2's end. The pattern in these 4 points is therefore chiastic, 65, 26, 26, 65. This suggests that Adonai can already in the biblical text substitute for the Tetragrammaton. Psalm 1, 2 through 3 compares the person who studies Torah day and night to well-watered and fruitful trees, a likely hint at Eden's trees and waters. The next Torah chapter in the Psalter is Psalm 19, whose verse 8, the law of the Lord is perfect, restoring the soul, anticipates, as I've already mentioned, Psalm 23's, he restoreth my soul, right, from another Edenic-like setting. That Psalm 1:2's Torah is that of Moses cannot be doubted for two reasons. First is the undisputed parallel of Psalm 1 in Joshua 1:8, where the book, Sefer, of the Torah is that of Moses. Next, Psalms 111 and 112, both of which famously echo Psalm 1, each contains the acrostic, right? Hey, Gimel Hey, Samik, Pe, Resh, right? So meditate and book, echoing elements of Joshua 1:8, right? Book of the Torah, and Psalm 1:2, right? Meditate in the Torah, right? So, and these two acrostics occur in Psalm 111 and 112 in the respective first three verses and last three verses, right? So each set of three verses of the Sefer acrostics in those two psalms comprise 26 words. Thus, the Psalter itself inserts a hint at Joshua 1:8's Mosaic Torah in the grouping of Psalms 1, 111, and 112. We can now appreciate how the hint at Joshua in Psalm 1:2 subtly anticipates Psalm 23:4's encryption of the name Joshua. And we can also now appreciate how Psalm 23 is actually just as much about the Torah of Moses as are Psalms 1 and 19. Now, Psalm 26 and 27 develop Psalm 23's temple theme. As commentators have always recognized, Psalm 27:4b, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, echoes Psalm 23:6, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of YHWH for length of days. And just as Psalm 23 cryptically hints at the name of Joshua, so Psalm 27:1's opening proclamation, Adonai Ori va Yeshai, right? The Lord is my light and my rescue or deliverance, reproduces the etymology of the name Joshua. Now, as 26 is the sacred numerical structure of land and temple in Psalm 23, so this is the case in Psalm 27 as well. And this is by no means the connection, this is so by means of the connection between Psalm 27 and the immediately preceding Psalm 26, whose enumeration agrees with the Tetragrammaton's numerical value. The acrostic, Aleph, Vav, Resh, Yod, my light, joins Psalm 26, verse 10 through 12 to Psalm 27:1. When we ignore the latter verses, one-word superscription. So this Ori acrostic, this my light acrostic, is quite artful in that its terminal yod is that of Psalm 27:1's Tetragrammaton, which is immediately followed by the straightforward word Ori, my light, in the phrase Yod He Vav He Ori, the Lord is my light. The verses later reference to fear, of whom shall I be afraid, obviously in Hebrew plays off the lines earlier Ori, this phonetic playoff of fear and light. The new Jewish Publication Society TANAKH correctly divides, as does Folkelman, Psalm 26's Hebrew text into 26 lines, each representing one kola, or stick. Not only does Psalm 26 have 26 kola, but it is also the case that in verse 1, the yod of the second Tetragrammaton is letter 26, and in the final verse 12, the Tetragrammaton's yod is also letter 26. Now, Psalm 26, verses 3 to 5, clearly harks back to the Torah Psalm, verse 1:1. Psalm 26:6's altar and verse 8's house introduce the theme of the temple, and Psalm 26:7's verse 7's wondrous works is a Torah title, as we see in Psalm 111. Psalm 26:11 through 12 ends the psalm with additional echoes of the Torah Psalm 1. Psalm 26 contains 26 instances of the letter Aleph, which is just the first letter of light, Ori, of that acronym. The numerical values of the Tetragrammaton's two halves are 15 and 11. And if we divide Psalm 26 into 15 and 11 stichoi, we find that in the first block of 15 lines, there are indeed 15 instances of Aleph, and in the block of 11 lines, there are 11 instances of Aleph. The evidence suggests that Psalm 26 was composed both to hint via its enumeration at the Tetragrammaton's numerical value and to serve as the Psalter's 26th chapter, which indicates the Septuagint Psalter's enumeration of this psalm is Psalm 25 is secondary. This is supported by another observation, namely the simple numerical value, mispar soduri, of or, light, is 27, which is congruent with the enumeration of Psalm 27 and its opening mention of light. Lastly, when we ignore Psalm 27:1 superscription, there are 27 words in the 4 verses that contain the ori, or my light, acrostic. The simple value of ori is 1 plus 6 plus 20 plus 10 equals 37. Psalms 26 through 27 contain a total of 74 instances of the letter Aleph, which is 37 doubled. 37 is also the simple value of Chokhmah, wisdom. In fact, the Psalter's first instance of the noun Chokhmah is in Psalm 37, where the synonymous parallelism together with the echo of Psalm 1:2 indicates it is a title for the Torah. The mouth of the righteous uttereth, that is, meditateth wisdom, at Chokhmah, and his tongue speaketh justice. The law, the Torah, of his God is in his heart, that is, in his mind. None of his steps slide. To be complete and to cover all of Psalm 26's Tetragrammatons, verse 1's Vav Yodhe Vave and verse 2's Yodhe Vave span 26 letters. Verse 6's Tetragrammaton is preceded by 26 letters. Lastly, verse 8's Tetragrammaton is followed by 27 letters, one more in rank than 26, and agreeing with the simple numerical value of or, light. We should not overlook that Psalm 26's word total is 84. We're not counting verse 1's one-word superscription. This means that when similarly disregarding Psalm 27:1's superscription from the beginning of Psalm 26, word 86 will be Psalm 27:1's ori, my light. This may suggest a correlation between light and Elohim, right? Recall Genesis 1:3, and God said, Elohim said, let there be light, whose standard numerical value is 86, Elohim. The nearest instance of Elohim is in Psalm 25's final verse 22. It also occurs in the construct state in Psalm 27:9, but more pertinent is Psalm 43:1's horizontally encrypted Aleph Vav Resh, right? Judge me, O God, and plead my cause, right? Whose God judge me is anticipated by Psalm 26:1's opening 2 words, Yodhe Vave, judge me. Psalm 43:1's horizontally encrypted word for light is soon followed by an explicit mention of light in the famous verse 3. O send out thy light and thy truth. Let them lead me, let them bring me unto thy holy mountain and to thy dwelling places. To sum up the relation between Psalms 1, 23, 26, and 27, the temporal and the Tetragrammaton's numerical value, their mutual implications become clear when we recall the trope of the temple as the dwelling place of the divine name, which is the sacred Tetragrammaton. This trope occurs profusely throughout 2 Chronicles 6 and again in 2 Chronicles 7:16. For now have I chosen and hallowed this house, that my name may be there forever, and mine eyes and my heart shall be there perpetually. This is God's corrective response to Solomon's earlier question in 2 Chronicles 6:18, which is often misleadingly quoted in isolation, divorced from its fuller context. Quote, but will God in very truth dwell with men on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain thee, how much less this house which I have builded. And yet we know God did dwell there. His name did. The relation between Lady Wisdom, or Lady Torah, and the temple becomes evident in Sirach 24. The temple is the dwelling place of Lady Wisdom, or Lady Torah. The high priest is her earthly embodiment through whom she ministers. This anticipates Philo of Alexandria's teaching on the Logos as high priest, or the high priest as embodiment of the Logos, or of the feminine Sophia, which for Philo is interchangeable with the masculine Logos. The theological constellation of text, which comprises a temple for the Tetragrammaton, the promised land, and time, became increasingly meaningful to Jewish scribes and through their influence to Jews in general in the age of exile with its absence of the temple. This is because of the temple's absence, Lady Wisdom, or the Torah, remains in the form of the Torah scroll. Each Israelite can hold this scroll, hold Lady Wisdom, and unite passionately with her by means of reading her. Michael Coogan's claim that what he calls Sirach 24's and Baruch 4's, quote, disingenuous and facile equation of wisdom with the Torah, unquote, reflects quote, and that it reflects a systematic effort to demythologize her, unquote, represents a distorted and short-sighted view. On the contrary, what Sirach and Baruch did was entirely natural, especially if we accept Bernhard Long's argument that links Lady Wisdom with learning and the educational or scribal culture of Israel. So, Pache Coogan, not only Job 28, but also Sirach 24 and Baruch 4, in fact, re-mythologized Lady Wisdom by expansively enriching her spiritual essence and horizons for application in Israelite daily life. The lady, therefore, is not thereby demythologized, but re-mythologized for the age of the exile until it ends. And may it end soon, and may the temple be rebuilt soon in our day, as the Cedar phrases it. When a book, the Torah, is thought of as a living person, at once heavenly and earthly, one cannot speak of a demythologizing. Those who carried out the re-mythologizing were the Jewish scribal elite, which overlapped with the temple priesthood during the period after the exile and during the Second Temple Age. After the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era, rabbinic authorities carried out this re-mythologizing further, even if in a different mode, in which Lady Torah's personification became generally symbolic, with the later Kabbalists returning to the pre-rabbinic mode, that is, restoring a fully robust muthemic personification of Lady Torah. The main end which it served during and after the Second Temple period was to secure and deepen Israel's intimate relation to Lady Wisdom. This compensation for the temple's absence was itself based upon and inspired by the Tanakh's complex structures, both numerical, mathematical, and letter or phonetic in nature. In turn, these largely reflect the numerical letter properties of the divine names as mediated through revelation, whose embodiment is Lady Wisdom, who is Lady Torah. Thank you.